Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of the Wars of the Roses, 1455, 1487. Now buckle up as we begin. In the mid-15th century, England stood on the precipice of civil war. King Henry VI, the pious but mentally unstable Lancastrian monarch, struggled to maintain control over his fractious nobility. His periodic bouts of madness created a power vacuum that ambitious lords eagerly sought to fill. The kingdom's recent defeats in the Hundred Years' War had drained the royal treasury and damaged the crown's prestige. Noble families, emboldened by the king's weakness, began forming rival factions. Chief among these was Richard, Duke of York, who possessed a strong claim to the throne through his descent from Edward III. The stage was set for a dynastic struggle that would consume England for over 3 decades, pitting the White Rose of York against the Red Rose of Lancaster in a bitter contest for supremacy. The first blood of the Wars of the Roses was spilled at the Battle of St. Albans on May 22, 1455. Richard, Duke of York, had been excluded from the royal council by Queen Margaret of Anjou and her ally, Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. Frustrated by his political marginalization despite being the king's closest male relative, York gathered an army of 3,000 men. He marched south from his stronghold in the north, claiming he sought only to remove the king's evil counselors, not to harm Henry VI himself. The royal army, caught off guard by York's swift advance, hastily assembled in the market town of St. Albans. What began as a political standoff quickly escalated into violence when negotiations failed. York's forces, led by the young Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, broke through the Lancastrian defences. The battle lasted barely an hour, but its consequences would reverberate for generations. Somerset lay dead in the streets, along with other prominent Lancastrians, while King Henry VI was captured, wounded but alive. Following his victory at St. Albans, Richard of York found himself in an unprecedented position. He had captured the king, but faced the delicate challenge of legitimizing his actions without appearing treasonous. York was appointed protector of the realm, effectively ruling England, while Henry VI recovered from his wounds and mental instability. However, this arrangement proved temporary and fragile. Queen Margaret of Anjou, a formidable French princess with fierce maternal instincts, refused to accept York's dominance. She worked tirelessly to restore her husband's authority and secure the inheritance of their young son, Edward, Prince of Wales. Margaret began rallying the remaining Lancastrian nobles to her cause, painting York as a usurper who threatened the rightful succession. The political landscape became increasingly polarized, with noble families forced to choose sides. York's position, while temporarily secure, rested on military might rather than popular acceptance. The Queen's resistance ensured that the conflict would continue, transforming what might have been a brief political crisis into the opening chapter of a prolonged civil war. The fragile peace shattered at the Battle of Wakefield on December 30th, 1460. Richard of York, overconfident after years of political maneuvering, made a fatal miscalculation. Hoping to crush Lancastrian resistance once and for all, he marched north to his stronghold at Sandal Castle with a relatively small force. Queen Margaret had spent months gathering a massive army in the north, drawing support from Scottish allies and disaffected English nobles. York found himself trapped in his castle, vastly outnumbered by the surrounding Lancastrian forces. Against the advice of his councillors, York decided to sally forth on December 30th, perhaps hoping to break the siege through bold action. The decision proved disastrous. York's army was overwhelmed in the fields outside Wakefield, cut down by superior numbers and fierce northern warriors. Richard himself fell in the fighting, along with his second son, Edmund, and his brother-in-law, the Earl of Salisbury. The Yorkist cause seemed finished, its leader dead, and its army scattered. Queen Margaret had achieved a stunning victory that appeared to secure her son's inheritance. The aftermath of Wakefield revealed the growing brutality of the dynastic struggle. Queen Margaret's forces, flush with victory, committed acts that shocked even hardened medieval warriors. Richard of York's severed head was mounted on the walls of York City, mockingly crowned with a paper crown in cruel reference to his royal ambitions. This desecration of a duke's remains violated the traditional codes of noble warfare and demonstrated how far the conflict had descended into personal vendetta. However, Margaret's triumph proved short-lived. York's eldest son, Edward, Earl of March, inherited his father's claim and proved to be a far more formidable opponent than anyone had anticipated. At just 18 years old, Edward possessed the charisma, military acumen, and political instincts his father had lacked. News of his father's death reached him in the Welsh marches, where he was campaigning against Lancastrian forces. Rather than fleeing into exile, young Edward chose to fight. His first test came quickly when Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, advanced with a Welsh army to prevent Edward from joining forces with the Earl of Warwick, who was marching south with reinforcements. Edward's first major test as Yorkist leader came at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross on February 2nd, 1461. The young Earl faced Jasper Tudor's Welsh army in the rolling hills of Herefordshire, determined to prove himself worthy of his father's cause. As dawn broke on the morning of battle, a rare atmospheric phenomenon appeared in the sky, a parhelion, or sun dog, creating the appearance of three suns shining simultaneously. While the superstitious Welsh forces interpreted this as an evil omen, Edward displayed remarkable leadership by turning the portent to his advantage. He declared the three suns represented the Holy Trinity blessing the Yorkist cause, or alternatively, himself and his two surviving brothers united in purpose. This quick thinking transformed potential panic into renewed confidence among his troops. The battle itself proved Edward's military genius. Despite being outnumbered, he deployed his forces with tactical brilliance, using the terrain to neutralize the Welsh numerical advantage. The Lancastrian army was routed, and Jasper Tudor barely escaped with his life. More significantly, Edward captured Owen Tudor, stepfather to Henry VI, and ordered his execution, a clear signal that the new Yorkist leader would show no mercy to his enemies. Despite Edward's victory at Mortimer's Cross, the Lancastrians struck back with devastating effectiveness. At the Second Battle of St. Albans on February 17, 1461, Queen Margaret's Northern Army achieved a stunning victory over the Earl of Warwick's forces. Warwick, the man who would later be known as the Kingmaker, suffered his first major defeat, demonstrating that Lancastrian resistance was far from broken. The battle's most significant consequence was the recapture of Henry VI, who had been a prisoner since the first battle at St. Albans 6 years earlier. Margaret's reunion with her husband seemed to restore Lancastrian fortunes completely. However, the Queen made a crucial strategic error that would ultimately cost her everything. London, the key to controlling England, lay open before her victorious army. The capital's citizens, terrified by reports of northern soldiers pillaging the countryside, prepared for siege or surrender. Yet Margaret hesitated, perhaps hoping to avoid the destruction that would inevitably follow if her battle-hardened troops entered the wealthy city. This hesitation gave Edward of York the opportunity he desperately needed. Racing south from his victory at Mortimer's Cross, he reached London before the Lancastrian army could advance. Edward of York's arrival in London marked a pivotal moment in the Wars of the Roses. The young Duke found the capital's gates open, its citizens preferring the devil they didn't know to Margaret's fearsome northern army. On March 4th, 1461, Edward made the boldest decision of his young life. He proclaimed himself King Edward IV. This declaration transformed the conflict from a struggle over Henry VI's councillors into an open contest for the crown itself. Edward's claim rested on his father's assertion that the Lancastrian dynasty was illegitimate, tracing his own rights back through the female line to Edward III. The proclamation was a desperate gamble that committed the Yorkist cause to total victory or utter destruction. There could be no compromise with a rival claimant sitting on the throne. Edward's coronation was necessarily a rushed affair, lacking the traditional ceremonies and ecclesiastical approval that legitimized medieval kingship. Nevertheless, London's support provided him with crucial resources and symbolic authority. The new king immediately began preparations for the decisive campaign that would determine whether his reign would last weeks or decades. Margaret and Henry VI had withdrawn north, gathering their forces for what both sides knew would be the climactic battle of the war. The climactic battle of Towton on March 29, 1461, stands as perhaps the largest and bloodiest engagement ever fought on English soil. Edward IV marched north from London with approximately 25,000 men, while Queen Margaret assembled an even larger army, possibly numbering 30,000 warriors. The two forces met on a snow-covered plateau in Yorkshire, with Palm Sunday's bitter wind driving flakes into the faces of both armies. The battle began at dawn with a devastating archery duel that favored the Yorkists, who had positioned themselves with the wind at their backs. Lancastrian arrows fell short, while Yorkist shafts found their marks with deadly accuracy. As the morning progressed, the combat devolved into brutal hand-to-hand fighting across the frozen fields. Edward IV proved his courage by fighting in the front ranks alongside his men, his towering presence and golden hair making him a rallying point for Yorkist morale. The battle raged for over 10 hours through a blizzard that turned the snow red with blood. By evening, the Lancastrian army had broken, fleeing north towards Scotland in complete disorder. The casualties were staggering. Contemporary accounts suggest that over 20,000 men died, making Towton one of medieval Europe's bloodiest battles. Edward IV's overwhelming victory at Towton seemed to end the Wars of the Roses decisively. Henry VI, Queen Margaret, and their son fled to Scotland, becoming exiles dependent on foreign charity. Edward's crown appeared secure, his claim validated by the most complete military victory in the war's history. The new king moved quickly to consolidate his position, pardoning many former enemies while redistributing Lancastrian lands to his supporters. For nearly a decade, England enjoyed relative peace under Edward's energetic rule. The king proved an able administrator, restoring royal finances and promoting trade that enriched both crown and merchants. However, the seeds of future conflict lay in Edward's relationship with his most powerful supporter, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. The man who had made Edward king expected to continue as the power behind the throne, controlling royal policy and marriage alliances. Edward, however, had no intention of remaining anyone's puppet. The first serious rift came in 1464, when Edward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a Lancastrian widow, instead of making the foreign alliance Warwick had negotiated. This marriage not only insulted Warwick personally, but also elevated the Woodville family to unprecedented prominence, creating new rivals for the Earl's influence. The Earl of Warwick's growing resentment toward Edward IV finally exploded into open rebellion in 1469. Warwick had not earned his nickname the Kingmaker lightly. He possessed vast estates, a network of loyal retainers, and the political cunning to challenge even a king. The Earl's grievances went beyond Edward's marriage to encompass broader questions of royal policy and noble privilege. Warwick believed he had created Edward's monarchy and therefore deserved to guide its direction. When the king proved increasingly independent, Warwick began plotting with other disaffected nobles, including Edward's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Clarence, ambitious and easily manipulated, had been promised Warwick's daughter Isabel in marriage and a share of royal power. The rebellion began with uprisings in Yorkshire, ostensibly led by a mysterious figure called Robin of Redesdale, who was actually Warwick's agent. These disturbances drew Edward north with a small force, walking directly into Warwick's trap. At the Battle of Edgecote on July 26, 1469, the royal army was crushed by Warwick's forces. Edward himself was captured, becoming the first English king to be taken prisoner by his own subjects since the Norman conquest. Warwick's attempt to rule through a captive king proved as disastrous as it was unprecedented. The Earl discovered that deposing a monarch was far easier than governing a kingdom. Without Edward IV's personal authority, royal administration collapsed into chaos. Tax collection ceased, local rebellions erupted, and foreign enemies began probing English defences. Warwick found himself caught in an impossible position. He could neither release Edward without losing control, nor continue ruling effectively without the king's legitimate authority. After several months of mounting crisis, popular pressure and noble opposition forced Warwick to restore Edward to his throne. The reconciliation in 1470 appeared complete, with both men swearing renewed friendship and Edward pardoning Warwick's rebellion. However, this restoration solved nothing fundamental. Edward had not forgiven his humiliation, while Warwick remained convinced that the king's policies threatened England's welfare. The fragile peace shattered when Warwick attempted another rebellion in 1470, this time supporting Clarence's claim to the throne. When this second uprising failed, Warwick fled to France, where he encountered the most unlikely ally imaginable, his former bitter enemy, Queen Margaret of Anjou. French diplomacy orchestrated a stunning reversal of allegiances that would give the Wars of the Roses their most dramatic twist. The Warwick-Margaret alliance launched the boldest gambit in the Wars of the Roses, the restoration of Henry VI after 9 years of exile and captivity. In September 1470, Warwick invaded England with French support, proclaiming his intention to restore the rightful Lancastrian dynasty. Edward IV, caught completely off guard by his former ally's return, found himself abandoned by nobles who had grown tired of constant warfare. The king's support melted away with stunning speed, forcing him to flee England with a handful of loyal followers, including his youngest brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester. They sought refuge in Burgundy, where Edward's sister Margaret was Duchess. Meanwhile, Henry VI was released from his Tower of London prison and restored to his throne in a bizarre ceremony that highlighted the artificial nature of his restoration. The simple, pious king had aged considerably during his captivity and showed little understanding of the political machinations that had returned him to power. Real authority rested with Warwick, who now ruled as the power behind a puppet monarch. However, the Earl's triumph was built on the shakiest of foundations, an unnatural alliance between bitter enemies and the restoration of a king whose mental frailty had originally caused the Civil War. Edward IV's exile lasted only 6 months, but it provided crucial time for reflection and planning. The deposed king realized that his previous victories had been incomplete. He had defeated armies, but never eliminated the fundamental causes of opposition. From Burgundy, Edward carefully prepared his return, gathering a small but loyal force of English exiles and Flemish mercenaries. His brother-in-law, Charles the Bold of Burgundy, provided ships and financial support, seeing Edward's restoration as essential to preventing French domination of the Channel. In March 1471, Edward landed at Ravensbourne in Yorkshire with fewer than 2,000 men, facing a kingdom where Warwick commanded vastly superior forces. However, Edward possessed advantages that numbers could not measure: personal charisma, proven leadership, and the knowledge that half measures had previously led to disaster. His march south became a masterpiece of propaganda and political maneuvering. At each town, Edward proclaimed he sought only to reclaim his inheritance as Duke of York, not to challenge Henry VI. This fiction allowed wavering nobles to join him without immediate charges of treason. By the time Edward reached London, his army had grown to over 7,000 men, and his true intentions could no longer be disguised. The Battle of Barnet on April 14, 1471, marked Edward IV's definitive return to power. Warwick, realizing that his former protégé could not be stopped by political maneuvering, assembled his army outside London to settle the matter by combat. The battle began at dawn in thick fog that created chaos and confusion on both sides. Warwick had dismounted his men and fought on foot to demonstrate his commitment to victory or death, a gesture that proved prophetic. The fog caused a tragic case of mistaken identity when Warwick's brother, the Marquis of Montagu, was killed by his own men who mistook his livery for Edward's in the poor visibility. As news of Montagu's death spread through the Lancastrian ranks, panic followed. Warwick's army began to collapse just as the fog lifted, revealing the full extent of their disorder. The Earl of Warwick himself, weighed down by his armor, was struck down while trying to reach his horse. The man who had made and unmade kings died in the mud of Hertfordshire, his political machinations finally ended by Edward's sword. With Warwick's death, the last great noble capable of challenging royal authority was eliminated. The age of overmighty subjects seemed finally at an end. Even as Edward IV celebrated his victory at Barnet, a new threat approached from the west. Queen Margaret of Anjou had finally returned to England with her son Edward, Prince of Wales, landing in Dorset on the same day Warwick died. Margaret's timing was catastrophic. Had she arrived weeks earlier, her forces combined with Warwick's might have overwhelmed Edward IV. Instead, she found herself alone, facing a victorious king with battle-hardened troops and renewed confidence. Margaret gathered supporters in the West Country, particularly from Welsh lords loyal to the Lancastrian cause. Her son, now 17 years old, provided a living symbol of dynastic continuity that Henry VI's mental weakness could not offer. The prince was everything his father was not: young, vigorous, and eager for battle. However, time worked against the Lancastrian cause. Edward IV marched west rapidly, determined to crush this final challenge before Margaret could gather her full strength. The two armies converged on the town of Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire, where the fate of medieval England would be decided once and for all. Margaret's supporters included some of the greatest names in English nobility, men who had remained loyal to the Lancastrian cause through decades of defeat and exile. The Battle of Tewkesbury on May 4th, 1471, brought the Lancastrian dynasty to its violent end. Edward IV deployed his forces with the tactical brilliance that had characterized all his victories, positioning his army to take advantage of the broken terrain south of the town. Margaret's forces, despite their desperation and loyalty, could not match the professional competence of Edward's battle-hardened veterans. The fighting was brief but decisive, with the Lancastrian army crumbling under sustained attack from multiple directions. The battle's aftermath proved more significant than the fighting itself. Prince Edward of Lancaster, the 17-year-old heir to the Lancastrian cause, was killed either during the battle or immediately afterward. Accounts differ on whether he died fighting or was murdered after capture. With the prince's death, the Lancastrian dynasty's future died with him. Queen Margaret was captured, her decades of struggle ending in complete defeat and the destruction of everything she had fought to preserve. The greatest Lancastrian nobles lay dead on the field, their cause finally extinguished after 16 years of civil war. Henry VI, the simple king whose weakness had started the conflict, died mysteriously in the Tower of London shortly after Edward's return to the capital. Edward IV's second reign appeared to establish permanent Yorkist dominance over England. The king ruled for 12 more years with unprecedented security, his enemies dead or in exile. Edward transformed from a warrior king into a successful peacetime monarch, promoting trade, rebuilding royal finances, and enjoying the pleasures of court life perhaps too enthusiastically. His marriage to Elizabeth Woodville produced two sons, Edward and Richard, ensuring the dynastic succession that had been the war's central issue. However, Edward's unexpected death in April 1483 at age 40 triggered the final, most dramatic chapter of the Wars of the Roses. The king's eldest son, now Edward V, was only 12 years old, requiring a regency that reopened all the conflicts the Civil War had supposedly settled. Edward IV had named his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as protector, but the Woodville family had no intention of surrendering their influence over the boy king. Richard, the youngest and most loyal of Edward's brothers, had spent his adult life serving the crown faithfully in the dangerous northern marches. Now, faced with Woodville attempts to exclude him from power, Richard moved decisively to secure his position as protector and safeguard his nephew's throne, or so he initially claimed. Richard III's usurpation of his nephew's throne in 1483 shocked even the violence-hardened nobility of late medieval England. After securing the persons of both Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, Richard declared their birth illegitimate and claimed the crown for himself. The princes in the Tower disappeared from public view, almost certainly murdered on their uncle's orders, though Richard was careful never to officially acknowledge their deaths. This act of kinslaying, even by the brutal standards of the Wars of the Roses, created a reservoir of opposition that would ultimately destroy Richard's reign. Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, emerged as the focus of anti-Richardian sentiment. Henry's claim to the throne was weak. He descended from the illegitimate Beaufort line. But Richard's unpopularity made even a dubious claim attractive to desperate opponents. Tudor had spent years in Breton exile, carefully building a network of supporters and awaiting his opportunity. Richard's usurpation provided that chance. In 1485, Henry landed in Wales with a small force of French mercenaries and English exiles, proclaiming himself the rightful king. Unlike previous pretenders, Henry found a country ready for change, where Richard's crimes had outweighed Yorkist loyalty. The Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, brought the Wars of the Roses to their dramatic conclusion. Henry Tudor's small army faced Richard III's superior forces on the Leicestershire plain, but numbers could not overcome the king's political isolation. Richard had alienated too many powerful nobles through his usurpation and suspected crimes. At the battle's crucial moment, Sir William Stanley's forces, who had remained neutral, charged into Richard's flank, tipping the balance decisively toward Henry. Richard III died as he had lived in his final years, violently and controversially. The last Plantagenet king was struck down in a final cavalry charge. His crown allegedly recovered from a thorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head on the battlefield itself. Henry's victory was complete, but his position remained precarious until he married Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, uniting the rival houses through matrimony. Their marriage symbolically ended the dynastic conflict, combining the white and red roses into the Tudor rose that would represent a new era of English monarchy. The Wars of the Roses had finally ended after 30 years of bloodshed, transforming England's political landscape forever and establishing the foundation for the Tudor dynasty's eventual greatness under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. If you liked today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.